Hello everyone, I'm Tomasz from the Institute of Central Europe. I'm from the Catholic University of Lublin, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Serhii Plokhii, Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi, Professor of Ukrainian History and Director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. Where are we now?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure talking to you.
And I would like to ask you several questions about the fall of communism and collapse of the Soviet Union, and also about Russia-Ukraine war and implication for security and the geopolitical situation in Central and Eastern Europe. And firstly, Serhii, I would like to ask you about the fall of communism in Central and Eastern Europe. So, with 35 years having passed since the communism passed in the region, do you agree that it had an impact on the end of Cold War in the region?
Absolutely. The fall of communism and the end of the Cold War, they're part of the same set of processes that were happening in the region in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. Another part of the story, apart from the end of the Cold War and fall of communism, was, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, which was another stage in the process of the disintegration of the Russian Empire, something that started during World War I, continued in 1991, and we are having this conversation in February of 2024, so the end of the second year of the big war in Ukraine, in the region, which again, I look at that as part of the same story of the collapse of the Russian and then now Soviet Empire.
Mm-hmm. And moving on to the fall of the Soviet Union, so based on your research, what factors contributed to its collapse? Do you believe that Gorbachev had a plan to dismantle the Soviet Union? So what's your perspective?
What we have here is a story that basically is familiar in the 20th century. It's the story of a number of countries, or one country, in this particular case, losing a major geopolitical confrontation. And that country turns out to be a multi-ethnic empire. This is the story of World War I. That's where the empire started to disintegrate. Continuation is with World War II. Big decolonization processes happening in the 50s and 60s. Again, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes some time for all these processes really to come to the fore. And now we have the Soviet Union losing really the Cold War. And the consequences are the same as was the case during World War I and World War II. There is also another important process to have in mind. Again, historical. I'm a historian. I look at that from the historical point of view. If you look in the Russian history at the war that doesn't go well, it brings some form of transformation. There can be reform. There can be a revolution. What we see is after the loss of in the Crimean War, the period of reforms, so-called liberal reforms, the Polish uprising is right there happening. The loss in the war in the Far East, the Russo-Japanese War at the beginning of the 20th century, and again, Pilsudski was certainly part of that story. What you see is the first Russian Revolution and then World War I not going well, another. So the Afghan War for Soviets not going well, the Cold War not going well. We got basically another crisis, an attempt for reform from above that eventually leads to the disintegration. So this is one important part of the story, which is called the crisis of the empire, the crisis at the center. But for the empire really to disintegrate, because that's different, let's say, from what happened after the Crimean War, different what happened after the first Russian Revolution. For that, you need also actors in the regions to have either mobilized national movements, or in other cases of other empires, they can be religious groups that are mobilized and are prepared actually to step into the vacuum and take part in this process of reimagining and redesigning really the former imperial space. So again, from that point of view, the Soviet Union is not something particularly different. There are differences, but there are also parallels. And it falls apart as the result of the weaknesses at the center of the empire, partially related to the international relations, and also the ability of the actors on the ground to step in and propose alternative visions of the space, of the ideology, of new countries, and these two things came together in 1991.
Yeah, absolutely. And now let's move to the Russia-Ukraine war and its origins. What's, in your opinion, is the primary issue in relations between Russia and Ukraine? From my perspective, values and principles are the most important, not geopolitics.
Mm-hmm.
So do you agree with this kind of perspective?
I generally believe in multi-causality of almost of every event and every development. Of course, some factors are more important than others. And what we witnessed in the last 30 years when it comes to the issue of values, and they are very closely connected to your historical historical development of a particular group or nation. What you see there is that Russia, that everyone hailed as really the future of democracy in 1989, 1990, 91. Mr. Yeltsin was there on the tank, serving as the symbol of that expectation, of that hope for Russia. Turned out to be actually an authoritarian state, on maybe in some elements on par with Stalinism, not even with Gorbachev era, not with Brezhnev era, not with Khrushchev era, on par with Stalinism. When Ukraine, where many looked at Ukraine and Ukrainian independence suspiciously, including in Moscow, saying that, okay, basically this is an old party, groups that are trying to create independence to preserve the communist regime in Ukraine. Ukraine turned out to be really one of the beacons of democracy in the region, one of very few post-Soviet republics that didn't have just a short flirt with democracy in the early 90s, but survived through. Democracy survived through this 30 plus years. So the question is why? And my answer to that is exactly that there is it is the issue of attitudes, values, it is the issue of political culture. For Russians, it's really very difficult, almost impossible to exist outside of the state, which is also almost by definition in Russian history an imperial state. Mm-hmm. And for Ukrainians, it's really difficult, and was difficult certainly until this latest stage of the war, to find an ally in the state. Ukrainian project came into existence to a great degree and using Polish model, of course, Mickiewicz and Kostomarov. There is very clear parallels there in their thinking. But it came into existence in revolt against the state. Like in Polish history in the 19th century, there were more than one state to rebel against. And so Ukrainians had two states at that time. But the idea was that the state was a foreigner. The state was someone who was really coming there to somehow use, abuse, and exploit you. And that is very different. And in that sense, also, if you look at the way how Ukrainian history constructed and Russian history constructed. Russian history is around Tsars, right?
Absolutely.
there are people whom probably we in Ukraine or in Poland would never call great, but they became known in Russia as Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and then was picked up by Voltaire and the West. But yeah, there was no ruler that would be known in Ukrainian history as great. Russian history is focused on the Tsars and on the rulers. You look at the Ukrainian history, it is focused on the Cossacks. And whatever was Cossack history, it's a separate issue. But if you look at the Ukrainian mythology of who the Cossacks were about democracy and the Cossacks were about equality. It almost looks like they came from the pages of the French Revolution, right? So that's and it matters what sort of mythology you have. Basically, because it reflects your values, it reflects your aspirations. And if you have your main rituals around Peter the Great and Catherine the Great and other emperors, or you celebrate the democracy and equality, that means you even if you can speak occasionally the same language, you really have very different. You belong to a very different group.
Absolutely. And regarding the outcome of the war, so do you foresee a new geopolitical landscape in emerging in Eastern Europe or in Europe as a whole? While the European Union and US support Ukraine, there are concerns about peace negotiations and halting the war. So, do you see any potential for peaceful resolutions?
Well, I certainly can comment on things that already are happening and suggest that, again, if the strands of today continue into the future, that's probably what the future will look like. One thing that we have very clearly and that didn't exist before year 2022 is what I call the return of the West. The return of transatlantic unity and cooperation between the United States and Europe that didn't exist since the Cold War. So that is certainly something new, and I believe will stand. Another thing that is happening with this current war is the disappearance or the process of disappearing of the gray zones in Europe. Gray zone to which Ukraine belonged, neither here nor there. Moldova, we don't know what will happen with Georgia. There were certainly high hopes for Belarus for a short period of time in 2020. I think that what this war already produced is that those are just gone in practical terms, and the process of the really legal response to this, international law, international organizations' response to this reality is already happening. Ukraine became the candidate member of the European Union, which of course no one would foresee before the start of the war. It's not easy, but it's not clear when it will be happening. But it's the discussions about NATO for Ukraine are there, when the decisions are already there for Sweden and for Finland, and Finland is already a member of the Allies. Again, Finland, another quintessential gray zone through the Cold War. So that is again something that reminds us about the Cold War, but the border moves. And that brings me to another very important point, that the what we didn't see during the Cold War and see today is that Europe actually becomes more and more an actor in its own right. We have today this absolutely dysfunctional situation in Washington, where there is a majority in the Congress for support of Ukraine, but the system is 18th century. The system really doesn't work well in the political system in the 21st century, and Europe steps into the vacuum. It's a slow process. It's not right away, but this is the role that Europe never played during the Cold War. It's also different Europe geographically and culturally, because now it includes countries like Poland, countries that belonged to Eastern Europe, which now, of course, position themselves, and they used to do that before as Central Europe, as quintessential Central Europe. And they become to play more and more central role in this European arrangement. So these are changes that we already can see, changes that probably will continue. On the other hand, there is whatever happens on the front lines. I don't see any scenario whatsoever with actually Russia becoming much stronger as the result of this war. First of all, half of its army is destroyed. The sanctions are there that probably will continue for a long period of time, and that changes relationship with China, where Russia becomes more and more client. So that's another big geopolitical change and big geopolitical shift. What about the peace agreement? I think it will be coming. The trick is that, historically speaking, the longer the war goes, the more chances are that it will continue to go. But wars end, and it will end in a situation where gray zones probably will not be there. And Ukraine will remain to be a frontier country, but it will be on the, as they say, on the right side of the tracks, so that it will be basically on the western side of this divide. So that's at least for me the most likely scenario.
And lastly, shifting focus to Poland-Ukraine relations. Do you believe this conflict, I mean Russia-Ukraine war, presents an opportunity to forge positive relations based on a shared history and based on some tensions between our countries?
I actually like very much your formulation. That I certainly agree that it presents this unique opportunity, and it's up to us whether we take advantage of it or we do it as too often happens in our history, that we just miss this opportunity. That's also a possibility. But there was one thing that I call a Polish miracle in this war. There were Ukrainian miracles, the resistance in the first months, and the Polish miracle for me is the way how the Ukrainian refugees were received in Poland. And there are, of course, geopolitical issues behind that, and there is a big concern about Russia, historical concern. There is also another thing, and especially when you look at the story with refugees from Middle East in Poland, but in Europe as well, and the crisis that was there. That unique really unique kindness with which Poles and Poland accepted Ukrainian refugees, say that despite all our battles about who was right and who was wrong, and who started first, and what action was retaliation, and what action was aggression, there is deep-seated cultural and historical code that our peoples share. And they showed us that it is there. There is no just other explanation. People were opening their apartments, inviting absolutely strangers to the sacred place, to the family. You can't really do that without some elements of shared history and shared shared values, and it's the task for us to build on that and not to explain this just by geopolitics and not to go back to the politics as usual.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you, Serhii, very much for this insightful discussion. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.